On the 20th of September 1519, Ferdinand Magellan left Spain to find a route to the famed Spice Islands in the east through the west. Granted with Spanish provisions, the Portuguese navigator left with over 200 men and 5 ships. For almost 2 years, the fleet of Magellan experienced starvation, disease, and mutiny. In March 1521, Magellan would reach the islands, which would be called the Philippines, and through interpreters, he was able to reach Cebu, where he found himself entangled in a case of classic inter-island politics, leading to his violent death in the hands of the natives of Mactan in April 1521. Who discovered the Philippines? Antonio Pigafetta's first voyage around the world by Magellan. Welcome to the first episode of Primary Sources and You, the second season of podcast, Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society.
All right, welcome back to podcast, everyone. And despite what seems like, well, a continuation of the tumultuous 2020, Happy New Year pa rin.
Happy New Year! Happy New Year, guys!
Happy New Year.
So, syempre, bago natin simulan ang second season ng podcast, pasalamatan muna natin ang lahat ng nakinig at tumangkilik sa ating first series na History 101, where we talked about the nature, meaning, and characteristics of history. So, thank you guys.
Thank
Yes,
you.
maraming salamat. And kung hindi nyo pa napapakinggan ang Season 1, head over to those episodes para man mas ma-appreciate ninyo ang halaga at saysay ng kasaysayan, particular yung pag-uusapan natin today.
So that's right. At para sa mga bago nating tagapakinig, kami ang host ng podcast. Ako si Vec.
Ako si Lee.
And I'm Aaron.
And it's very fitting to open 2021 with an episode on the quote-unquote discovery of the Philippines by Ferdinand Magellan. Bakit? Kasi ngayong taon, if you're doing your math, we are actually commemorating the quincentennial anniversary of Magellan's arrival in the Philippines. So 500 years na ang lumipas, simula nung lumapag ang kanyang fleet sa Visayas.
Yeah, that's right. So 5 centuries ago, Magellan, leading a Spanish armada, reached the Visayas. So what was the context of this event? Ano yung nangyari sa daigdig ng panahon na to? Like, why would Magellan go on such a tedious, extremely dangerous voyage?
Well, there were things that ought to be considered during this period and before the 1500s or the 16th century. Una, tingin ko, kailangan tingnan dito yung the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 1400s or on 1453 when they racked Constantinople and claimed Turkey or Istanbul at yun yung naging sentro ng kapangyarihan ng kanilang imperyo. At pangalawa, maganda rin na makita ito sa konteksto nung quest of the Iberian powers, the Portugal and Spain, for the supremacy in the spice trade. Pwede rin i-argue na magkaugnayan. Siyempre, nung lumalakas ang Ottoman Empire, they had the control on important seas like the Baltic, the Adriatic, the Black Sea, and Portugal and Spain, na nung panahon na to ay relatively mas mahirap, poorer, kaysa sa Ottoman Empire. They had to seek for alternate routes to break the Islamic monopoly.
Definitely, no? So mahalagang ma-point out natin nga yung parang Game of Thrones dun sa Europe nung time na yon, nung lumakas yung Portugal and Spain. Na syempre dahil nga katulad ng nabanggit ni Vec, after these empires started building their territories kasi natapos nila yung halos 700 years na conquest ng mga Muslim sa Iberian Peninsula, no, nung mula dun sa 711 hanggang 1492. So yung victory na yon ng mga Iberian kingdoms eventually would lead to the consolidation of their political and economic power in Europe. Kaya sila din yung magkakaroon nung kumbaga capital to launch these expeditions and try to find ways, yun nga, to break the monopoly of the Muslims.
At itong dalawang kapangyarihan na to sa Europa during this time, mahigpit yung competition nila. So much so that the Pope, the considered legitimate leader of the Holy Roman Empire, had to step in and draw out what we would know as the Treaty of Tordesillas. Pamilyar yung mga estudyante dyan naririnig nila yan pero malamang nakakalimutan nila kung ano yung saysay niyan. Pero basically, ang ginawa dito ay the Pope sliced the earth like an orange and divided it into the, siblings na nag-aaway. Kasi parehong Catholic kingdoms itong dalawang ito eh. Yung East napunta sa Portugal at yung West ay napunta sa Spain.
At sobrang political nung paghahati na yon kasi yung Pope nung time na yon, si Alexander, was actually Spanish. Yung unang nangyari ay naglabas siya ng Inter Cetera na pronouncement niya na naghati ng mundo. Kaso nagreklamo yung mga Portuguese na parang baka nalulugi sila. So nagkaroon ulit ng negotiation that gave birth to the Treaty of Tordesillas. Kaya naurong yung yung unang hati ng mundo, hindi kasama yung Latin America doon sa part ng Portugal. Pero nung nag-Treaty of Tordesillas, umurong ng konti yung linya. Kaya nasama yung tip ng Latin America, ng South America in particular. Kaya napunta siya sa Portuguese side. Kaya naging Portuguese yung territory ng Brazil ngayon. Originally, Spain lahat yung part na yon. Pero nung nag-renegotiate sila kasi nagreklamo nga yung mga Portuguese kasi, oy, Espanyol si Alexander, baka nalulugi kami. So, inurong ng konti, nasama yung Brazil doon sa part ng Portugal.
Pero kung to this actually, yung naging hatian dito, mas naging challenging siya for Spain. Bakit? Kasi during this time, very much coveted ang spices bilang, I don't know, prestige goods. And the spices during this time, yung at least those that mattered, like cinnamon, cloves, they only grew in the Far East. All known routes were through the East. At iyon ay nasa bahagi na inassign sa Portugal. And therefore, Spain had to find a way to get to the Spice Islands through a different route. Contrary to popular belief or dun sa myth na before Magellan, yung mga tao ay convinced pa rin na flat ang mundo. Hindi na actually. For centuries, they already knew that the world was spherical. Ang hindi nila alam, wala silang masyadong knowledge, ay gano'n siya kalaki. And later, this lack of awareness would actually cost Magellan a lot. Lalo na when they reach the Pacific. Kasi gulat na gulat sila. Paglabas nila nung Strait of Magellan, hala, sobrang laking ocean. So, they were, at sea for a very long time. Tapos nung nakakita sila ng land, ayan, narating nila ang Guam. Anyway, so it is in this context na parang kailangan mag-explore ng Espanya ng alternatibong daan para makapunta sa East. Kaya naman, nung lumapit ang isang Portuguese na navigator, si Ferdinand Magellan, before the King of Spain during the time, Charles I, at meron siyang plano na pumunta nga sa Moluccas gamit ng isang alternatibo na daanan or na ruta, talagang sinuportahan siya. Kahit na Portuguese siya. Nag-defect ito si Magellan. Parang hindi niya nakasundo yung hari ng Portugal nung panahon na to. So, nag-defect siya sa Spain. So, King Charles I provided all of the provisions. Binigyan siya ng mga armas, ng goods na pangregalo at pang-trade, pangkalakal. 5 barko yung ibinigay sa kanya. At yun nga, tulad ng nabanggit kanina, more than 200 men. In some estimate, 260, 270 men. At isa sa mga kasama niya dito ay ang isang Italian nobleman, scholar, cartographer, na si Antonio Pigafetta. And the role that, Pigafetta played in this journey was actually very, very important, especially in terms of posterity.
Now, in order to decipher the commencement of my voyage, having heard that there was, in the city of Seville, a small armada to the number of 5 ships ready to perform this long voyage, that is to say, to find the islands of Maluco, from whence the spices come, of which armada the Captain General was Fernando de Magallanes, a Portuguese gentleman, commander of St. James of the Sword, who had performed several voyages in the ocean sea, in which he had behaved very honorably as a good man. I set out with many others in my favor from Barcelona, where at the time the emperor was, and came by sea as far as Malaga, and thence I went away by land until I arrived at the said city of Seville.
So that was an excerpt from Antonio Pigafetta's first voyage around the world by Magellan. So ikinukwento niya dito yung kanilang paglalayag. Siya ay nanggaling sa Seville, and then 28th of September, they left Sanlúcar. At ayun, so they started their long journey. Sobrang interesting itong adventure ni Pigafetta kasi ang natira lang doon sa more than 200 men na kasama nila ay 18. 18 lang sila. And I don't know, sobrang swerte na out of these 18 men, kasama dito si Pigafetta na talaga namang nag-keep ng records at nag-chronicle nung buong paglalakbay. So, and these accounts were actually very valuable kasi these were first-hand accounts. So talagang, sabi nga natin, primary source siya. He was an eyewitness. He was there from the beginning. He lived to see the end of the journey. And, he was deliberately recording it for these purposes, no, for posterity. So he fought in the Battle of Mactan, he reached the Moluccas, and he actually made it back. So good for him. And later on, Pigafetta's account would be considered as, among the most important documentary primary source in Philippine history, lalo na doon sa sinaunang panahon or the pre-colonial period. So kasi ito yung isa sa mga earliest records, written records. Kasi nga, this is arguably our first European contact in 1521. It also tells the account of the initial contact between East and West, lalo na sa konteksto ng Visayas or ng Pilipinas. So, and pag binasa mo talaga yung accounts niya, kahit yung English translation na tulad ditong binabasa natin dito sa discussion natin, sobrang fascinating kasi binibigyan tayo nito ng glimpse of the dynamic and active economic life in Visayas. It also gives us an insight about political networks and relationships. And I think, actually, itong account ni Pigafetta, maaaring isa sa mga naging pangunahing basehan ng stereotype na, yung mga Pilipino, hospitable yung mga yan. Kasi Pigafetta was reporting na the natives received them warmly, fed them, sheltered them, tapos nagpabinyag pa ng maramihan. But I think it has to be understood that Cebu was a big trading port during this time, at this period. It's not as if Magellan and Pigafetta and their crew were actually the first foreigners na nakita ng mga tao. So sanay silang tumanggap talaga kasi potential na trading partners itong mga ito.
Parang 'di ba, 'pag inisip mo, ano yun parang bagong
Oo.
kliyente, 'di ba? Kapag ikaw yung salesperson, 'di ba, na gusto mong magkaroon ng good relationship. Siyempre talagang magpapakitang gilas ka na, "Oh, dito kayo magstay." Lalo na 'di ba, sinabi nga ni Vec na may inter-island politics. So kung madaming pwedeng puntahan na islands at mga barangay nga, siyempre kung sa'yo nag-unang pumunta, siyempre gusto mo magstay, sa'yo yun.
Saka sa West kasi sanay sila na, kapag may encounter tayong mga foreigners, gera, conquest, ganyan, 'di ba? Dito sa Asia, sa East, trade talaga. In fact, 'di ba sinasabi na yung unang pagpasok nga ng Islam sa Southeast Asia ay through trade at hindi through conquest or
Hmm.
religious war or jihad and so on. Kaya, I mean, given this idea na dinat na nila, merong mga complicated social structure, political networks, and thriving economic activities. Kaya masakit sa ulo yung laging claim or connotation that Magellan discovered the Philippines. How can you discover something that's already been there? Diba? That has been inhabited by people, regularly dinadaanan ng mga goods, diba? Trading
Mm.
ports, etc. etc. Kaya,
Oo.
typical European arrogance yun yung sabihin nila na, oh, we have discovered this land. Tapos biglang may mga tao, oh, we have discovered people.
Oo,
Di ba?
definitely. Tsaka 'pag tinignan mo kasi yung sentence na yun na Magellan discovered the Philippines, kailangan maintindihan natin that it may be true kasi Magellan discovered the Philippines for Spain. Kasi hindi nila alam na may Pilipinas. Pero kung from a Filipino perspective and from a wider global perspective, hindi natin pwedeng tanggapin that Magellan discovered the Philippines. Kasi sabi nga ni Vec, meron ng mga tao, tapos may economic life at political life na yung mga tao dun. So, they're not there to be found and discovered, di ba?
And
Exactly.
interestingly, I mean, we're talking about Pigafetta's account of the first voyage around the world by Magellan, but this is not really the first account of the Philippines
Yes.
existing.
Exactly.
May accounts
Mm.
na prior to this that talks about these early communities in the Philippines, like, Mai in Mindoro, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
yeah.
Tapos,
Mm.
we have the Laguna Copper Plate inscription, which talks about this system of debt,
Yeah, yeah, utang.
nagkautangan.
Mm.
So, although we are talking in this episode about Magellan and Pigafetta, this doesn't mean that prior to them, the Philippines was a random pile of rocks in the Pacific. There was a thriving group of people in these islands.
Exactly. Balik tayo kila Magellan. pagdating nila sa Visayas, hindi naman Cebu yung una nilang napuntahan. Hindi naman sila sa Cebu unang napadpad. Alright? So, pinunta sila doon kasi sinabi sa kanila na, itong isang polity na to, ito talaga yung malaki at mayaman at ito talaga dumadaan yung maraming mga trade. They were brought there, and you see, historians actually summarize the motivation of both Portugal and Spain into three G's: the God, gold, and glory. So they really engage in explorations or quote unquote discoveries. They colonize, they pillage, they enslave people because they wanted to acquire precious metals. And in a mercantilist economy, sobrang halaga nun. At spices, na tulad ng binabanggit natin kanina, ay prestige goods siya eh. Parang more than the real purpose that it serves. Meron siyang, yung mga mayayaman dati, lahat, sa Europa, lahat nilalagyan ng spices, di ba? Kaya nga nauso yung spiced wine. Pinapabango nga nila yan eh. Di ba? Parang may mga account na parang yung pagkain nila practically talagang covered in spices. And also, they wanted to Christianize native population. Okay. In fact, parang may mga nagsabi din na kaya lang daw pumayag ang Santo Papa nung panahon na to na i-colonize halimbawa ng Espanya ang Amerika, ang New World, ay dun sa premise na i-Christianize nila itong native population na to. So, the expedition of Magellan was under the same umbrella. They were seeking for the spice trade route and for precious metals like gold and silver. Yung silver, nakuha nila yan sa South America. Alright? Pero yung spices, they wanted to go to the Far East. Kasi kapag binasa niyo si Pigafetta, talagang mapapansin niyo yung fixation niya sa spices saka sa ginto. Like halimbawa lagi niyang kasabihin na yung bahay nung king, nung native king may mga adorned with gold, or yung king himself ay nagsusuot ng golden rings, large golden rings sa kanyang tenga, or yung kanyang dagger or bangles ay gawa din sa ginto. Tapos may nakapagsabi sa amin sa lugar na to, yun daw, golds the size of eggs ay nakakalat-kalat lang dun sa isla. So, laging meron siyang ganung fixation lagi. Yun lagi yung pinapansin niya. Kasi yun yung interest nila. Di ba? Kaya naman sila nandun ay para sa mga ganong klaseng riches na ginagawa nila para sa Espanya. So anyway, what happened next? So Magellan reached Cebu. He was received by Raja Humabon. So may mga historiador din na nagsasabi na among the datus, among Rajas, parang merong, 'di ba? Merong primus inter pares eh.
Yes.
'Di ba? Na merong, I think during this time si Humabon ito. Siya yung leader nung pinakamayaman, pinakamakapangyarihang polity sa Visayas.
Kasi kailangan natin siyang tingnan na yung mga polities, yung mga communities, they exist almost autonomously from one another, 'di ba? Although they have custom laws and then they share a language, politically they are separated by their leadership. So yung mga datu, 'di ba? They would form, conglomerates, alliances amongst them to protect themselves para maprotektahan nila against raiding ng ibang mga barangay. So, in this particular context sa island, sa Cebu, si Humabon yung
Yes.
pinakamakapangyarihan sa kanila. So, parang siya yung elected representative, parang ganyan, no? Parang siya yung batch president nung mga dato nung time na yun.
Oo. So and given this context, kaya naman nung dumating si Magellan, sabi ni Pigafetta sa kanyang account, through interpreters, Humabon asked Magellan to pay tribute. Which is, standard practice. May dumaong na foreigners, foreign vessels, malabang makikipagkalakal yan, magbayad ka ng tribute or magbayad ka ng buwis. Alright? Kaya lang si Magellan, he refused. Sabi niya, meron na akong hari, I am already under a particular king, at sa kanya lang ako magbabayad ng buwis, I won't go to another. So, di ba? Tigas ng face. So, ayaw niya magbayad ng tributo. So, sabi ni Pigafetta, yun daw interpreter, sinabihan si Humabo na yung king nito, very powerful. So, I think it would be good kapag nakipag-friends or nakipag-ally ka na lang sa kanila, di ba? Kasi maybe to drive them away or something like that. Ganun yung interpretation ni Pigafetta, pero siguro sa modern reader pwedeng basahin na Humabon was, being the good businessman here. Diba? Okay,
Yeah.
sige, wag ka magbayad ng buwis, but it doesn't mean, parang, are we really letting go of this potential business? Parang ganon. So, Humabon still received Magellan despite Magellan's refusal to pay tribute. So from there, so they shared, so they broke bread, kumain sila, lagi, umiinom, ina-entertain nila yung kanilang guests. And from there, Magellan conducted the mass, and he conducted mass baptizing of the natives. So si Humabon, nagpabinyag, he was renamed Don Carlos after King Charles of Spain. And
Mm.
people were generally okay with the new faith. And tingin ko kasi during this time, hindi bago yun eh. Yung pagkakaroon ng bagong pananampalataya. I mean, with all of their tradings, di ba? Lagi sila ngayon may encounter na bagong faith. Pero Pigafetta himself recorded that the natives actually resisted burning their idols. Yung mga anito nila, nung sinasabi ni Magellan na, meron lang tayong one true God. So, sunugin nyo yung mga animistic na mga imahe at mga idolo na tinatago nyo. And people refused. Sabi ni Pigafetta himself, they made excuses. Humabon himself made excuses. Like sinasabi na, kailangan nila yan kasi meron silang mga relatives na may sakit. They needed the idols for their healing, etc., etc. And this is a very interesting part of reading Pigafetta, and reading primary source in general. Kasi ito yung yung tinatawag na isang American historian na si William Henry Scott na cracks in the parchment curtain. 'Di ba? Kung saan yung mga mambabasa ng primary sources can interpret and make meaning out of certain parts of the text kahit na hindi yun yung intended na kino-communicate ng author, 'di ba? I mean, from here, kahit di man sinabi ni Pigafetta, it can be inferred nga that the natives were okay to receive new faith, but they resist, or ibang usapan yung utos na i-abandon yung kanilang old beliefs. 'Di ba? Yun yung fun part ng pagbabasa ng primary source.
Interesting point lang din yan, no? Yung idols issue. Kasi hanggang ngayon, nagpapatuloy yung ganyang pagtingin sa mga rebulto at least. Kasi, sorry, kakatapos lang nung Feast of the Nazarene,
Translation.
yung
Traslasyon.
translation. So, kitang-kita mo rin kung paanong, as early as this, parang dumalabas na yung syncretism talaga. At yung effort na, at talagang mangyayari, that a different kind of Catholicism, Christianism will
Emerge.
develop in the Philippines,
Yeah.
will emerge.
As they went, so tapos na, marami nang nabinyagan and so on. According to Pigafetta, kinukwento niya, merong isang local chief na pumunta kay Humabon. At he sought for Humabon's assistance in dealing with a certain Datu Lapu-Lapu na nire-resist. Kasi, as we know, Humabon was, as we mentioned earlier, Humabon was the considered primus inter pares among the chieftains. So expected na yung within that network. So if Humabon was, recognizing Magellan, nagpabinyag siya, etc., etc., expected na yung mga mas maliliit na Datu ay susunod, would follow suit, alright? And itong local chief na to, sinasabi niya, sila Lapu-Lapu ayaw. So,
Yung pangalan ng local chief niya, ba parang Zulu? Zula?
Zula, parang gano'n.
Zula.
Si
Zula. So, parang sinasabi niya na ayaw niya sumunod sa'yo, so kailangan mo siyang i-deal with. So, dito parang lumalabas na mukhang may conflict na talaga sa pagitan ni Humabon at ang mga taga-Mactan. And Magellan, I think, employing the classic divide and conquer, parang sinasabi niya na, sige, since we're friends, we're brothers, let me deal with this local chieftain. Sinabi niya, ito yung sa ibang mga pagnanarrate nitong part na to, ang sinasabi ay Zula asked for Magellan's help or Humabon asked for Magellan's help. They didn't, according to Pigafetta himself. Magellan volunteered.
Yes.
Na parang siguro they wanted to flex some European muscles.
Definitely.
Let me deal with this person. At confident siya kasi feeling niya bakal yung mga baluti nila. At yung mas modern supposedly ang kanilang mga armas. So, sige, go. At sabi niya pa, in-instruct niya si Humabon na huwag kang makikialam, okay? So, I got this. I got the Christian God behind me. Parang may mga ganun pa. So they went to Mactan, all right? Wanting to invoke their superiority and wanting to persuade Lapu-Lapu to kowtow to Humabon and in effect to Magellan. And then what happened was this.
We were 49 in number. The other 11 remained in charge of the boats. When we reached land, we found the islanders 1,500 in number, drawn up in squadrons. They came down upon us with terrible shouts, 2 squadrons attacking us on flanks, and the third in front. The captain then divided his men in 2 bands. Our musketeers and crossbowmen fired for half an hour from a distance, but did nothing, since the bullets and arrows, though they passed through their shields made of thin wood, and perhaps wounded their arms, yet did not stop them. The islanders, seeing that the shots of our guns did them little to no harm, would not retire, but shouted more loudly, and springing from one side to the other to avoid our shots, they at the same time drew nearer to us, throwing arrows, javelins, spear hardened with fire, stones, and even mud, so that we could hardly defend ourselves. Some of them cast lances pointed with iron at the Captain General. They perceived that our bodies were defended, but that the legs were exposed, and they aimed at them principally. The captain had his right leg pierced by a poisoned arrow, on which account he gave orders to retreat. We were oppressed by the lances and stones which the enemy hurled at us, and we could make no more resistance. As they knew the captain, they aimed especially at him, and twice they knocked the helmet off his head. We fought for more than an hour until an Indian succeeded thrusting a cane lance into the captain's face. He then, being irritated, pierced the Indian's breast with his lance and left it in his body. And trying to draw his sword, he was unable to draw it more than halfway on account of a javelin wound he received in the right arm. The enemy, seeing this, all rushed against him, and one of them, with a great sword, gave him a great blow on the left leg, which brought the captain down on his face. Then the Indians threw themselves upon him, so that they deprived of life our mirror, light, comfort, and true guide.
All right. So that was so Pigafetta was in the battlefield himself, ano. So he was sa kanya account, he was fighting side by side with Magellan. And indeed Pigafetta was actually wounded in the Battle of Mactan. So yun yung nangyari. Imagine, ilan lang sila, wala pang 50. And then pagbaba nila ng shore ng Mactan, 1,500 natives. Hindi ko alam if Pigafetta was, blowing up the number, but obviously
Yeah.
they were hugely outnumbered.
Tsaka remember din yung context nung time, March, April, 'di ba? Sa beach. So, can you imagine yung mga Europeans in their metal armors navigating the heat in the
Yeah.
Philippines? So,
Yes.
so 'di ba, parang the elements, the number of people they're fighting against with, 'di ba? Parang
And you're walking on water actually. I mean,
Yes.
shallow
definitely.
water.
Yes.
Mm-mm.
Kasi parang kinukwento niya ni Pigafetta, hindi makalapit yung boat nila eh. Kasi
Kasi
nga,
shallow
mababa yung
yung
tubig,
water.
tapos may mga rocks. Parang sabi
Mm.
niya, hindi na kami makalapit. So bumaba sila doon. And imagine, native, sanay na sanay sa,
'Di
sanay na
ba?
sanay
So,
sa beach, at mas sanay sa terrain generally. Tapos, meron pa ditong kwento na nung nakita ni Magellan na na-overpower sila, inutusan niya some of his men to go to the villages and burn down houses para ma-intimidate. So, pinasunog niya
mm.
pa. So, anong naging effect nun? Akala niya matataranta yung natives, lalo silang nagalit. So,
Oo.
mas lalo silang naging fierce,
Oo.
mas lalo silang naging
Oo.
merciless.
At I think mas maintindihan natin yan if we devote a separate episode siguro no discussing yung difference ng perspective about
Mhm.
war ng natives tsaka ng mga
Yes.
Espanyol, 'di ba? So mahirap
Yes.
na komplikadong bagay yung pagtatagpo ng East and West
Alright.
culturally.
That's right. Isa pang interesting point dito. Sinasabi ni Pigafetta that Don Carlos or Rao Humabon at this time could actually send reinforcement. Pero pinanood lang
Oo.
sila. Pinanood lang sila. So, well, to be fair, ang sabi naman kasi ni Magellan, di ba, huwag kang makikialam. Di ba?
Oo,
And,
tsaka si Magellan kasi hinipe niya rin na parang, Europeo kami, we have
yeah,
superior weapons. Feeling ko may ganyang factor yan na parang kayang-kaya namin yan kahit kaunti lang kami.
exactly.
Diba?
So, and I mean, aminin natin, kahit na marami na silang kahit marami ng beses silang nag-inuman at this point at may binyagan nang nangyari, I think the relationship was too shallow. And maybe humabo na panseeing that, fraud naman pala yung Christian God kasi na-overpower kayo ng ganyan kadali ng mga taga-Mactan. So, and actually later on, Pigafetta would suspect na yung mga natives ay tinatraidor sila and so on. So, pero to be fair, 'di ba? After na nangyari, they fled. What remained of Magellan's men fled back, sailed back to Cebu. Humabon tried to claim Magellan's body. Parang inoferan niya, sabi ni Pigafetta, Humabon offered the people of Mactan parang kahit na anong gift or kahit na anong good para ibigay sa kanila yung katawan ng Captain General. But they refused to. They wanted to keep Magellan's body as a memento of their victory, according to Pigafetta himself. So they really never, they never got to give Magellan a burial. So yeah, what remained of Magellan's men sailed to tinuloy nila yung kanilang journey. So dumaan pa silang Palawan, ganyan. And they reached Moluccas, yung talagang kanilang original destination ng November 1521. So at doon, narating nila yon, talaga namang pinuno nila what remained of their ships ng mga cloves, ng mga spices. So despite everything, when they reached Spain, sinasabi na kumita pa rin si King Charles dun sa nangyaring circumnavigation. So they reached Spain almost exactly 3 years after they left. And this is what Pigafetta had to say about this.
At last, when it pleased heaven, on Saturday the 6th of September of the year 1522, we entered the Bay of San Lucar, and of 60 men who composed our crew when we left Maluco, we were reduced to only 18, and these for the most part sick. Of the others, some died of hunger, some had run away at the island of Timor, and some had been condemned to death for their crimes. From the day when we left this Bay of San Lucar until our return thither, we reckoned that we had run more than 14,460 leagues, and we had completed going round the earth from east to west. Monday, the 8th of September, we cast anchor near the mole of Seville and discharged all the artillery. Tuesday, we all went in shirts and barefoot, with a taper in our hands, to visit the shrine of Saint Mary of Victory and of Saint Mary of Antigua. Then, leaving Seville, I went to Valladolid, where I presented to His Sacred Majesty Don Carlos neither gold nor silver, but things much more precious in the eyes of so great a sovereign. I presented to him, among other things, a book, written by my hand, of all the things that had occurred day by day in our voyage.
Alright. So, ayun. So, kinukwento niya yung end ng kanilang paglalakbay. A very eventful one. And despite heavy losses, very influential, yung naging successful na pag-circumnavigate nila ng daigdig. So, after Magellan died, a certain Juan Sebastian Elcano took over and became Captain General. So, siya yung nag-lead dun sa remaining na ship. So, remember, out of 5 ships, isa na lang yung natira. That was the ship Victoria. Dapat dalawa yan eh. Yung isa yung Trinidad. Kaya lang, yung ship na yon ay na-capture ng mga Portuguese nung nandun sila sa present-day Indonesia. So, isa lang talaga yung nakauwi.
Kasi nga technically nasa Portuguese side sila eh.
Yes.
Diba?
Tama. So, kinapture sila.
Oo.
So, ano yung mga bagay na mahalaga nating alalahanin in studying 1521 in Philippine history and in looking at Pigafetta's account? Una, lagi nating paulit-uliting sabihin that Magellan and therefore the Europeans did not discover the Philippines. Okay, it has always been there. Okay? So, hindi nila na-discover yung Pilipinas. Dumating sila, merong isang dynamic and thriving economic life, merong isang sibilisasyon, merong mga, political networks at play and alliances. Meron silang sariling sistema at strukturang sosyal or panlipunan. So, ayan. Pero, ibigay natin yung credit, they were successful in circumnavigating the globe or the world at this point. So, and in fact, yung spices na talagang kinuha nila, nung narating nila yung Moluccas, yung November of that year, it was enough, yun nga, to cover the cost of the voyage And it was enough to actually earn Spain some profit pa rin. At syempre, yun nga, tama naman din si Pigafetta, invaluable yung naging knowledge na nakuha nila. So, pangalawa, kapag binabasa natin si Pigafetta, it is very important to bear in mind this context that he was a European who lived at this period, that he was of course very fascinated sa mga nakita niya na mga exotic na mga bagay-bagay. Halimbawa, ako, isa sa mga paborito dyan na random, yung describe niya yung buko, yung nyog.
Yeah.
Parang
Gulat na gulat sila sa joke niya, no?
sobrang mundane nun sa atin, very ordinary, pero sa kanila talagang describe niya in detail na ito yung husk, tapos pag binuksan mo may walnut, etc. etc. So that's a very, fascinating way of reading Pigafetta. Understanding na itong taong ito ay nagbumula sa isang, very foreign na konteksto. And Pigafetta, despite, of course, certain biases, bilang isang tao, a man of his time, alright, remains a very important primary source in studying Philippine history.
See, it's very exciting to read actual primary sources, and it should not be boring, 'di ba? You should find kung ano yung interesting sa pagbabasa nito kasi you get, 'di ba? First person primary account nung mga nangyari in particular periods in our history. So next episode, tatalakayin naman natin yung primary source na Customs of the Tagalogs na sinulat ng isang Franciscan missionary na si Juan de Plasencia. So dito, titignan na natin yung lipunan at buhay ng mga tao sa mga isla ng tinawag ng mga Espanyol na Pilipinas nung nagsisimula yung kolonisasyon. So, paano kaya yung observations ng mga Espanyol sa pamumuhay ng mga tao nung panahon na yun?
And I'm pretty sure that that's going to be a very interesting discussion. If you want to know more about podcasts, you can visit our website, www.podcast.org. You can also check us out on several podcasting platforms like Anchor FM, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and many others.
And we're also very much looking forward to your questions and to your feedback. So you can send us all of these through our social media accounts linked in the description. Or you can also send us an email sa team@podcast.org. So huwag kayong mahihiyang magtanong or magbigay ng mga komento kasi we really love hearing from all of you. So once again, thank you very much for listening and have a good day.